迎收看华尔街焦点节目。通货紧缩，北京自食经济改革无力的恶果。法国，中国2年来首次出现通货紧缩的趋势，引发财经报纸《回声报》以及《费加罗报》的关注。《回声报》认为，虽然物价下跌的趋势已久持续多个月，对已经陷入低迷状态的中国经济来说是雪上加霜，不过不应该过于扩大通货紧缩的影响，因为从宏观的角度来说，中国经济依然存在着0.800分号的潜在的通货膨胀，而且专家认为，中国政府必将启动货币以及投资措施来缓解通货紧缩的压力。相比之下，费加罗报的分析文章则是更加令人担忧。这篇文章的标题是“中国陷入通货紧缩，世界第2大经济体究竟发生了什么？”文章指出，继7月份出口大幅下降之后，中国又陷入了通货紧缩，这使人们进一步怀疑中国经济的反弹能力。文章引述美国经济研究公司荣鼎集团指出，中国经济陷入低迷，除了房地产因素之外，地方债务超重以及过度依赖出口，受到欧美经济衰退以及美中贸易战巨大冲击等等，都是中国经济的弱点。因此，可以说是因为北京政府经济改革无力所导致的恶果。在今天中西方关系紧张的背景下，在西方主张与中国脱钩、减少对中国的依赖的趋势下，在西方减低对中国投资的倾向下，中国经济更将面临雪上加霜。文章指出，越来越多的人担心，中国可能会进入一个经济增长缓慢的时代，类似于日本失去的几十年，消费者价格和工资在一代人的时间里停滞不前。因此，许多经济学家呼吁实施大规模的经济刺激计划。观察家们希望，周三的糟糕数据可能会给中国政府带来压力，迫使其采取真正的措施。此外，有分析师指出，中国物价下跌也可能对西方货币政策产生影响，因为亚洲巨龙的通货紧缩趋势必将使西方重新审视自己的银行利率政策，未来几个月内是否还应该一如既往递上台利率。为了攻打台湾，我将不惜牺牲自己的生命。中国中央电视台近日播出纪念中国解放军建军96周年而拍摄的8集纪录片《追梦》，引发法国十字架报的关注。十字架报驻东京记者多里安·马洛维奇的文章评论说，追梦毫不含糊地展示了中国人民解放军为军事入侵台湾所做的准备，引起中国国内民主义者的共鸣。文章引述专门研究中国政治的加拿大政治学家亚历克斯·帕耶特指出，在内部清洗的传言沸沸扬扬之际，这一系列活动旨在传出中国军队内部团结一致的信息。Alex Payet 同时也是战略情报和地缘政治咨询公司 Group Celsius 的首席执行官。他补充道，中国政府希望表明，面对不稳定的外部环境，中国共产党和中国人民解放军是团结一致的，试图让各军团放心，让他们相信在党的指挥下，解放军能够捍卫中国的利益。该系列片讲述了解放军士兵们誓言牺牲生命的故事。海军陆战队排雷员左峰承诺道，如果不能安全清除台湾海滩上的地雷，他将用身体炸毁他们。一位名叫李鹏的飞行员说，如果弹药耗尽，他随时准备把飞机扔向目标。亚历克斯·帕耶特分析说，类似的宣传片很可能暴露了军队和党内的某种狂热，他们似乎需要自己说服自己有能力执行这样的军事行动。当然，如果因此而认为中国军队只是一只纸老虎，那就大错特错了。请大家继续收看华尔街焦点节目。拿什么来拯救你？中国经济？德国之声中文网。中国经济正面临越来越严重的通货紧缩风险，引发了德语报刊的高度关注。法兰克福汇报指出，北京在需求侧以及供给侧都没有太多办法来缓解这场危机。商报则认为，中国经济降温是北京有意为之，目的是纠正多年来过快发展累积的问题。法兰克福汇报以中国手里的选项越来越少为题，刊发评论指出，中国经济正在陷入严重危机，不论在需求侧还是供给侧，北京都没有太多办法。由于需求疲软，中国滑入了通货紧缩。同时，中国政府又想对外展示强大，试图扭转西方国家降低对华风险的舆论。目前为止，北京的经济政策措施十分谨慎。央行基星期前略微下调了利率，新任行长还宣布了一些其他措施。其他部门也有类似的表态，但是实际行动却不多。当前出台的措施耗资并不大，这很有可能与各地方政府的财政紧张有关。之前的防疫政策造成了巨大的财政负担，而且以往是重要财政收入来源的房地产业，如今已经成为了中国经济的长久麻烦。许多地方政府债台高筑，因此难以在需求侧有太大作为。至于供给侧， 中国政府这些年来一直在扩大对经济的管控，科技行业受到的监管力度不断变大。现在，中国政府最好放松管控，推动经济自由化。这不仅仅是为了赢回企业的信心。不过，虽然已有些许放松管控的迹象，但是北京依然不太可能做出根本性的转向，这样的转向在意识形态方面很敏感。所以，中国政府手中的选项很有限。也因此，北京大张旗鼓地宣扬一些小措施，希望以此来扭转外界的负面报道。但是这样的措施不足以造成大的改观。杜瑟尔多夫出版的德国商报则持不同观点。该报驻华记者以中国经济降温是政府有意为之为题，摊平认为中国眼下的通货紧缩并不会演变成日本曾遭遇过的常年经济低迷。毫无疑问，中国政府面临的经济挑战是艰巨的，尤其是建筑行业的降温拖累了增长率，给宏观经济造成了巨大压力。这同样也压低了价格。房地产市场的发展走向无疑是当前中国经济的最大风险因素，中国完全有可能陷入持续的通货紧缩中。然而，中国经济降温其实不仅仅是政府的有意为之，即便从经济学视角出发，中国经济也早该降温。多年来，中国经济过快增长是靠房地产行业过热运行、毫无节制的举债等人为手段强行推高的。建筑行业一度直接或间接地贡献了1/3的经济增长。习近平正在要求摒弃这种虚幻的增长。就目前种种迹象来看，中国政府准备承受经济转型的痛楚。和2008年全球金融危机期间不同，中国政府这次并没有拿出大规模举债投资基础设施的措施，而是斥资投入科技竞赛，赶超发达国家。北京还寄希望于私营企业扩大投资、居民家庭扩大消费来提振经济。中国政府希望在防疫措施结束后，消费者能够把积攒的存款慷慨地支出，从而促进经济快速复苏。这一愿望并没有实现，私人消费的增长十分缓慢。尽管如此，消费方面的增长却是持续的。今年上半年，消费品以及服务业支出成为了最重要的增长引擎，会展业、旅游业、餐饮业的消费额尤其突出。在服务业，价格甚至在上涨。如果消费能够进一步复苏，那么普通消费品价格也有望再次上扬。请大家继续收看华尔街焦点节目。德国经济界对美国限制对华投资感到忧虑。德国之声中文网。德国经济界对美国总统拜登签署对华投资限令感到担忧。德国工商联合会外贸问题专家表示，欧盟应与美国密切协调，防止美国的投资限令对欧洲经济产生负面影响。德国经济界对美国总统拜登签署对华投资限令持怀疑态度，同时担心欧盟也有可能出台类似的规定，带来不利影响。德国工商联合会外贸问题专家福格尔巴赫周四8月10日在接受路透社采访时说，目前已经存在内容广泛的德国企业出口规定，如果再实施境外投资审查机制，将造成过度监管。福格尔巴赫说，所以从资本自由流动的角度来说，欧盟也应该避免实施境外投资审查机制。他表示，欧盟应与美国密切协调，防止美国的投资限令对欧洲经济产生负面影响。福格尔巴赫指出，德国经济与国际经济密切相连，德国1/4的工作岗位依赖出口业，工业领域甚至一半的工作岗位都和出口业相关。他强调，因此欧洲外贸战略的目标必须是加快全球市场和投资地点的开放，而不是由国家主导对外贸易。只有这样做，企业才能推动实现供应链多样化，才能加强竞争力。他补充说，我们和德国企业举行了很多场谈话与沟通之后发现，企业对去风险非常重视。美国总统拜登希望禁止美国企业在中国对敏感技术领域进行投资。昨天8月9日，他签署了一项行政命令，授权财政部全面禁止或者部分限制美国企业对中国包括半导体、微电子、量子资讯技术和部分人工智慧在内的特定领域的投资。德国批发商和出口商协会认为，德国企业不太会介入这场争端。该协会首席经济学家阿尔伯尔对路透社表示，我预计德国企业会谨慎应对，因为在这些高度敏感的高科技领域，德国企业通常与美国合作伙伴合作，或至少与美国有联系。他说，没有人愿意冒险开展这种合作，因为美国市场太重要了。此外，还有长臂管辖的问题。一旦出现疑问，德国公司将可能受到美国法律的制裁。德国政府不久前公布的新中国战略呼吁德国企业降低与中国做生意的风险，也被称之为去风险化。 欧盟委员会一名发言人在回复路透社电子邮件问询时回复表示，我们与美国政府保持密切联系，并期待在这一议题上继续合作。欧盟及其成员国在防范我们的资金、经验和推动科技进步的专业知识被用于增强破坏国际和平和安全的军事、情报能力的问题上拥有共同的利益。欧盟委员会在今年年底就这一议题提出一项倡议。请大家继续收看华尔街焦点节目。3元早餐，中国通缩严峻的象征。法国路透社报道说，在北京被比喻是餐饮界的优衣库的南城乡连锁店内，顾客只需花3元人民币就能随意吃喝到八宝粥、皮蛋瘦肉粥、胡辣汤、小米粥、牛奶等7种早餐。一顿3块钱的早餐说明了通货紧缩对中国的冲击。71岁的高姨英译对路透社说，疫情期间出现了许多便宜的选择，而且一直都有新的便宜货，你只需知道如何找到它们。他和孙子来到在这家在北京有160家的连锁餐厅吃早餐。一顿3块钱的早餐说明了通缩对中国的冲击。中国餐馆老板们竞相以低价和优惠来吸引食欲大不如前的消费者。观察家们担心，这种销价竞争的做法可能会威胁到小商店，因为他们无法抵抗大集团的强势促销手段。就像90年代日本的通缩一样，中国经济增长可能因此受到威胁。报道援引上海中国市场研究集团的 Ben Cavender 指出，为了吸引顾客，优惠是必要的。因此，这些零售商面临着寻找利润空间的巨大压力。与西方民众不同，中国人在疫情期间不得不在经济上勉强度日，而政府优先补贴制造业。一旦解封，就不会出现一些经济学家所希望的情况。在工资和福利几乎没有增长、劳动力市场饱和的情况下，中国的消费支出受到了经济停滞的限制。广东省食品安全促进联盟副会长朱丹鹏英译表示，降低价格，为消费者提供物有所值，也就是更好性价比的战略，符合当前的经济形势。周四，在北京的南城乡连锁餐厅人满为患。据工作人员说，自从该公司开始以3元的价格提供早餐后，每天早上都是如此。南城乡没有回应路透社的置评请求。现在位于中国首都的汉堡连锁店西少爷也降了价，其餐点价位为10元人民币 1.26 欧元。在中国经营肯德基餐厅的百胜中国正通过提供 19.9 元 2.5 欧元的菜单来吸引消费者。百胜中国的总经理 Joey Watt 告诉路透社，人们回来了，但人均消费却下降了。在我们看来，疫情似乎是很久以前的事了，这不是什么大不了的事。然而事实并非如此。路透社最后写道，一位不愿透露名字的餐馆员工董某周四中午去了北京的一个市场，但什么也没买。他说，我有房贷，还有一个孩子，我别无选择。请大家继续收看华尔街焦点节目。华兴资本创始人包凡被继续留置。德国之声中文网。据华兴资本控股的公告，该金融机构的股创始人、董事长和实际控制人包凡目前仍在配合中国有关机构的调查。包凡今年2月被带走调查。财新网报道说，包凡被有关部门留置的期限曾延长至8月6日，这次未再次延期，但未明确实现。8月9日晚，华兴资本控股在港交所公告称，本公司知悉包凡目前继续配合中国有关机关的调查。董事会重申，集团目前的业务及运营维持正常。公告还称，该公司的执行委员会将继续负责维持集团的日常运作。包凡为华兴资本控股创始人、董事长和实际控制人，曾效力于摩根士丹利和瑞士信贷，参与多家跨国企业资金筹募、银行借贷和兼并交易。2005年，包凡创建投行华兴资本，2018年将公司在港交所挂牌上市。华兴资本参与多起知名的中国互联网融资并购案，覆盖智慧制造、科技、数位健康、新消费、企业服务等领域，包括打车公司滴滴和快的合并、外卖巨头美团的并购案等等。今年2月7日，包凡被中国纪委监委人员带走调查，予以留置。2月16日，华兴资本控股发布公告称，暂时无法与公司董事会主席、首席执行官和控股股东包凡取得联系。次日，华兴资本控股股价大幅下挫，盘中一度大跌 50%。2月26日，华兴资本再次发布公告表示，其董事长兼首席执行官包凡目前正在配合国家有关机关的调查。5月31日，中国财经媒体《经济观察报》报道，知情者表示，中国监察机构对于知名投资人包凡的留置，从2023年5月7日起延长3个月。 从包凡2月被带走到现在，华兴资本控股股价已从 10.19 港元每股跌至 7.27 港元每股，跌幅超30%。今年4月，该集团曾推迟年度审计报告，并暂停股票交易。据《华尔街日报》报道，包凡被拘留与一项涉及该行一名前行长的腐败调查有关。财新网8月9日报道，据财新多方了解，包凡被带走前数月，华兴资本就经历了不寻常的人事动荡。华兴资本总裁兼华兴证券香港董事常从林于2022年9月上旬被有关部门带走。财新获悉，从林被查实包凡就被边控，无法出境。从林曾是工行在香港设立的全资子公司工银国际董事长。中国当局迄今未就包凡的下落发表任何官方声明。包凡案是中国企业高管在习主席领导的全面反腐败斗争中失踪且没有任何解释的又一案例。有加拿大公民身份的商人肖建华于2017年在香港失踪，后被证实在中国大陆被拘留。去年8月，上海市第一中级法院判处肖建华有期徒刑13年，并处罚金650万元人民币。他创建的明天控股被判罚款550.3亿元人民币。谢谢大家收看华尔街电视。
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注今日华尔街频道。这期的华尔街人物关注中国经济学者胡星斗。他最近提出让中国走出当前局势困境的10条建议，成为了网络上的热议话题。胡星斗是北京理工大学经济学教授，毕业于华中科技大学，1978年华中科技大学船舶电气自动化专业的本科，1982年船舶电气自动化专业的研究生，1985年进入了北京理工大学工作后，由工科转向了文科，从事政府经济学、发展经济学教学与指导研究生的工作。有文章提到，胡星斗实际上对理工科是不感兴趣的，中学时年龄小，糊里糊涂，便由着老师选了理工作为他自己的发展方向。尽管如此他的理工科成绩一直很好，不过他始终认为理工不仅内容枯燥，而且仅仅是器物层面的东西，是属于雕虫小技，没有上升到道这样的一个高度，对于国家进步的作用十分有限。当时胡星斗还是一名十分热心的文学青年，担任学校诗社的社长，文学活动频繁而丰富。工作之后，胡星斗认识到中国的根本问题不在于科学技术层面，现代化的瓶颈是政治社会制度和更深层次的文化缺陷。他认为自然科学研究成果再多，如果没有合理的制度，也起不了多少作用，只会白白浪费。他认为自己天生对社会和对人生的感悟比较多，对自然科学那种冰冷冷的东西没有兴趣，于是他下决心转而研究社会人文科学，这才是从这个工科转型为文科的一个插曲。这个由来是这样的，在1998年，胡星斗撰写的《问题中国》等2本书集结出版。1999年，胡星斗破格提升为北京理工大学的正教授，这被称为当时全中国的这个政治经济学学科最年轻的正教授。在2000年，网络兴起，胡星斗还创办了当时中国最早的个人学术网站之一，即胡星斗中国问题学网。该网所发文章多为胡星斗的思想和学术的观点，由于文笔犀利，观点尖锐，直指社会的焦点话题，很快在当时就引起了国内外的关注和相应的讨论。胡星斗也是废除劳教、废除户籍、信访研究、政治改革研究的代表人物之一，也因为网站被关闭起诉而胜诉的中国第一人，被载入有关法学著作。在2019年的3月，胡星斗当时批评中国官方对舆论的监管不断缩紧，言论空间被进一步压缩，没有独立思想存在的空间，并宣布不再接受任何采访。当时他是这么说的，他说在这个时代几乎没有任何独立思想存在的空间和缝隙， 连讨论中国古代哲学问题、思想科技问题的文章都会被删除，评论中国经济、批评国有企业都可能惹来麻烦。而胡星斗最近引发议论的文章叫做《关于走出当前局势困境的建议》。在这篇文章中，胡星斗提到，改革开放以来，中国的现代化事业取得巨大成就，近年来在防范金融风险、脱贫攻坚、环境治理等方面也卓有成效。同时，毋庸讳言，随着国内国际局势的变化，中国的现代化事业也陷入了困境。如何摆脱困境，开创新改革开放事业？本着三个有利于的原则，是否有利于中国现代化的实现，有利于国家的长治久安，有利于中国人民的民生与幸福？胡星斗建议高层：一是重申坚持11届三中全会以来的路线与方针，特别是以经济建设为中心，继续改革开放的决心。第二点是重申坚持18届三中全会全面深化改革开放的决议。第三个建议是重申一线治国及建立法治政府、法治国家、法治社会的决心。第四点是重申回归邓小平的韬光养晦、低调发展、不当头、不争论、不以意识形态划界的策略和原则，力争与发达国家搞好关系，和平共处，避免新冷战。第五个建议是重申彻底否定文革的态度，改变斗争思维，回归和平和谐的理念，改变发言人特别是外交部门发言人的红卫兵、战狼形象，回归中华民族5000年文明的温柔敦厚、谦谦君子、开放包容的大国风范。第六个建议是坚持邓小平理论，解放思想，实事求是，领导人的任期制，坚持毛泽东思想，谦虚谨慎，不骄不躁，做人民公仆，为人民服务，开展批评与自我批评，提倡百花齐放、百家争鸣，鼓励党内的民主监督，并将之制度化。第七个建议是改变不惜代价支援发展中国家、不惜代价引进落后国家留学生的做法，停止或低调推行一带一路倡议，集中精力于国内的建设。那一带一路是遭到世界银行、国际货币基金组织等组织的抵制，中国也已经蒙受了巨大的经济损失。鉴于南海岛礁建设及中国的强大导致美国战略重心东移和印太战略的实施，这严重妨碍了中国现代化的进行。第八点建议，胡星斗就提到，建议暂停相关建设，避免潜在的军事冲突。鉴于钓鱼岛、南海诸岛的争端经常导致中日、中国与东盟一些国家关系的紧张，建议回到搁置争议、共同开发的既定方针，严格遵守国际条约，也比如 WTO 协议等，严格保护知识产权，促进公平竞争，禁止国进民退，停止政府对企业的大量补贴，缩减国有垄断范围，让国民企成为市场主体，厉行法治，改善营商环境，保护民企财产，建立由企业家创新精神主导的真正市场经济，争取让国际社会，特别是美国、欧盟、日本在不久的将来承认中国的市场经济地位。第10个建议是淡化中国模式，禁止所谓的中国模式的输出，维护现有的国际秩序。中国是现有的国际秩序的最大受益者。美国和西方通过几十年甚至200-300年的战争，赢得了全球化、市场化、民主化的世界潮流，为中国的改革开放和现代化提供了良好的外部环境。中国没有理由去改变它。试想，如果没有全球市场经济、2战后世界秩序的建立，让计划经济、管制经济、极权主义、宗教极端主义盛行并主宰世界的话，中国哪有改革开放的机会？对谁改革开放呢？胡星斗总结以上10条也许是中国走出困境、走向现代化的不二选择。好了，以上就是今天华尔街人物的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注我们的6度简报网站，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
美国国家安全局局长保罗·中曾根将军进行广泛讨论，他负责监督美国国家安全。中曾根将军与 CSIS 高级顾问和前 NIC 总法律顾问讨论他对地缘政治动荡、不断变化的威胁矩阵、人工智慧的进步、伙伴关系的力量，以及重要的是，重新授权外国情报监视法 FISA 第702条的独特5年观点。 在炉边谈话之后 ，Gerstel 先生主持一场关于 FISA 702在说明情报界保护国家方面的重要作用的小组讨论。加入他的是 NSA 总法律顾问 April Doss 和 Trinity Cyber 总裁兼前白宫国土安全顾问 Tom Bossert。
It is our distinct honor today to host General Paul Nakasone, who all of you know has had an illustrious career as the dual-hatted lead of both U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency. Following General Nakasone's fireside chat, Glenn Gerstel, who I'll mention in a moment, will lead a panel discussion between April Doss, NSA General Counsel, and Tom Bossert, former Homeland Security Advisor in the last administration on 702 reauthorization. There will also be a question and answer discussion after that session. Glenn, I will hand this over to you. Glenn served as General Counsel of the National Security Agency and Central Security Service from 2015 to 2020. Glenn, it is a great honor that you have joined us at CSIS. So I will turn the floor over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you to CSIS. It's a delight to be here. In general, it's a real honor to be on the stage with you, and for me, it's a personal treat. Most of my former clients don't want to have any further communication, so I appreciate your being an exception to that rule, so it's a genuine treat for me. You became the director of NSA and the commander of Cybercom a little over 5 years ago. And before that, when I first had the pleasure of meeting you, you were the head of the Cyber National Mission Force and then head of Army Cyber. You went from being a 1-star to a 4-star in just 6 years, which is an impressive sign of how well regarded you are. And I'd like to use that sort of 5-year time period that during your tenure at NSA as the framework for our discussion this morning by looking at some of the extraordinary technological changes that have transpired over that period, as well as a whirlwind of geopolitical events which have completely changed the scene, I think, from when you first took office. So, especially in the areas you're responsible for. So let's, if I may, just start off by going back to the summer of 2018, May of 18. You first became the director. I recall we had just months before reauthorized Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which I know you're going to comment on. We were still thinking about what the Russians had done back in the 2016 elections. We were thinking about at NSA dealing with the aftermath of the Snowden problems and the alleged shadow brokers' theft of tools, et cetera. So there's a lot of turmoil going on. What was your sort of thought, if you now looking back, what was that your sort of first thoughts in the summer of 18 when you took office?
Well, so Glenn, let me just first of all echo your thanks to CSIS and certainly to Dr. Jones and to President Hamry for hosting us today. But in the Wayback Machine, summer of 2018, you have to back up a few months to the spring of 2018. I'm in my confirmation hearings in March. I come out of my confirmation hearings pretty well focused on the fact that we are going to have a safe and secure election in 2018, or they're going to find a new director and new commander. And my sense is that after taking over on the 4th of May, the following week, we're already talking about the 2018 elections. How do we have a safe and secure election? How do we do that? How do we bring the command and the agency together? And so from there all the way to the 6th of November and then beyond as the results are obviously confirmed, it's all about the elections. You recall the number one priority at the agency and command, safe and secure elections. That's an interesting point, but I think the more important point is the fact that the midterm elections of 2018, the growth of the Russia small group, the ability for us to do this type of work sets the foundation for where the agency and the command are going to operate for the next 5 years. How is the dual hat going to function? Very, very closely between the command and the agency. How are we going to do new and innovative things, such as hunt forward operations, being able to send teams forward at the request of a government to hunt on those networks? How do we look at the private sector differently? How do we actually leverage this idea of, hey, the private sector has an incredible amount of power, and how do we do that? And then obviously the partnerships that form not only between the agency and the command, but the agency, command, and FBI, agency, command, CISA, agency, command, private sector. That's all the summer of 2018. And so I think that that's a really important piece for me as I think about it. It's really the jumping off point for where we're going to go.
Okay, so one big part of that, as you said, was elections was mostly, not totally, focused against the Russians because of what they did in the interference in 2016. But on the cybersecurity side, apart from the elections, they were also, and continue to be, a very serious threat in the cybersecurity world. And I wondered how you think about that now. It seems like my sense is that many people feel we sort of got caught flat-footed with the SolarWinds intrusion, apparently by the Russian FSB. It took months for that to be detected. We've seen in the interim a wave of ransomware attacks coming from, evidently emanating from Eastern Europe and Russia. Some of that continues to this day, as you just pick up every day's news headlines, there's new ransomware attacks. How do you think about the ways we need to counter the Russian cyber maliciousness in particular, apart from elections?
So I think that, and you mentioned SolarWinds. So I think the first thing I would say on SolarWinds is, when you're doing an intelligence operation, you never want to get caught. They got caught. And so I think that should be perhaps the story that goes with SolarWinds. But the other story is, hey, interestingly, that the CEO and the founder of Mandiant comes to our agency the Tuesday before Thanksgiving to have a discussion about what he's seeing. It starts to formulate in our ideas this idea of, hey, maybe if we had a unclassified facility outside of our agency where the private sector and our agency can talk to people, wouldn't that be powerful? And the other thing that I would say is that it always comes back to, what are the competitive advantages? What are the competitive advantages of our agency and command? Well, I think it begins with this idea of we operate outside the United States. It's foreign intelligence. We have an understanding of what our adversaries are doing, and then how do we communicate that with the private sector? This is the growth of the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. This is that NSA has today, unclassified facility outside of our gates that's engaging with over 400 different private sector companies in the defense industrial base. And again, this idea is, how do we both give and get? Why do they talk to us? They talk to us because we have this incredible element of intelligence that comes from our work outside the United States. But they also talk to us for the fact that when they're talking to one of our folks, it's not, hey, hold on a second, let me write this down and I'll get someone that really understands this. No, they're talking to the experts. And that's really powerful. And I think that that's where we've been able to look at, additions and abilities such as, ransomware and 0 days and supply chain, and being able to bring the power of what our agency and command does to address those.
Okay. We'll come back to Russia. Let me spend a minute on China. It seems like in the intervening years, China has, to some extent, taken center stage, at least in the cyber area. We could talk about the decades of cyber theft, cyber-propelled disinformation, but just it seems like there's been a little bit of a change. Maybe it's just my impressionistic sense. In the last several months or year or so, it sounds like there's almost a step up in the level of sophistication on the Chinese. We've seen reports about their allegedly hacking into the Japanese classified networks. There was a report of a post on that. It sounds like there's a Chinese attribution to the Microsoft Outlook hacks that apparently led to the emails of our Secretary of Commerce and our ambassador to Beijing being read by adversaries. Even more ominously, we've seen reports about apparent Chinese infiltration into infrastructure in Guam. So my sense is that maybe they've made a big step up in increase in their cyber sophistication. I wanted to ask you if that's your perception or is my layman's perception correct? And there's a lot of heated commentary about the spy balloon, et cetera, and how we need to deal with the Chinese. But let me just put it bluntly, are they ahead of us in cyber and surveillance? Are they equal to us? How do you think about them?
No.
Chinese in this regard?
No.
Okay, all right.
No.
That's clear.
But let me say this, here's the piece, right? I mean, I think this is to your really good lead in here, which is there is a scope, scale, sophistication that we ascribe to what China is doing today. Are they getting better? Yes. But I think the question always comes back to us as we think about this, how do we address it? And what are our competitive advantages against a nation that has so much scope, so much scale, and increasing sophistication? Well, I think it begins with this idea of our competitive advantages are, first of all, being able to understand what our adversary is doing. You mentioned intelligence gathering. You mentioned this idea of, utilizing different capabilities to spy on us. Certainly we have to address this. I am very concerned, and we are addressing the issues that we made public in May of this past spring about China living off the land, this idea of positioning themselves in different critical infrastructure elements of the United States, our allies, our territories, to perhaps utilize in the future. Why are they doing that? Why are they in our critical infrastructure? So that's the thing that we are addressing today.
Can I interrupt? Is your sense that perhaps the Chinese are infiltrating some of our infrastructure networks, not only for surveillance, but in essence for positioning themselves to do future malevolent actions, such as taking down networks, and they want to be in that position if they need to sort of pull the trigger,
certainly what, Glenn, we have said is that there is an option that provides the Chinese against many different scenarios. And if you're in our critical infrastructure, it's not to collect intelligence, it's our view. And so we want to make sure we're addressing that, we're doing that today. But I think the other piece that we have to think about is, so clearly, if it's not just the ability for us to understand what our adversaries are doing, I think the other piece that is our huge advantage is the private sector. I mean, this is what we've learned from Russia, Ukraine. Being able to leverage the private sector, being able to work with the private sector, being able to understand what the private sector is doing is tremendously important. And the other piece is we have a global set of partnerships. We have a global set of partnerships that allow us a look throughout the world, allows us a series of like-minded nations to be able to address actions such as these. This is something that is truly a competitive advantage for us, and this is what we're utilizing today to address some of the issues that you've just highlighted there.
Let me maybe turn the question around and ask something, not to put you on the spot, but how confident are we, given the technical sophistication of the Chinese hackers, how confident are we that our own classified networks, for which you are the national manager under statute and executive order, you're responsible for the Pentagon's classified networks, defense contractors' classified networks, that's your responsibility. How confident are we that our classified networks have not been infiltrated, they haven't been compromised? And maybe you could even comment on how do we know if that's happened?
So confident and vigilant. And I think that those two are very, very important words. It's not confident that's just we're confident. It's confident we have a vigilance every single day that we're looking and making sure that our classified networks, the networks that are responsible for our most sensitive communications or the operations of our most lethal weapon systems, that they're assured, that there is an integrity there. You spoke about my responsibilities as a national manager under my role as the Director of National Security Agency. I'm also responsible for the DoD Information Network. So both the classified and unclassified networks in my role as Commander U.S. Cyber Command. So an example of what we're doing is how do you work with different combatant commands to keep this vigilance alive? We learned this in Ukraine. Why is it that we're able to share intelligence so effectively with a partner? Because we set the theater, being able to understand that what we're going to share has to be protected. The other piece is that I would come back to this idea of hunt forward operations. It's the fall of 2018, and we have a really intriguing idea bubbling up from the bottom. Folks that are saying, hey, wouldn't it be really interesting if we sent a team at the request of a foreign country to hunt on their networks? At the request of a foreign network. Hey, please come, help us look at what's happening on our networks. If you find malware, if you find, tradecraft, if you find some other areas that you think are concerning, we want to be able to publicize that. One of the first places we go, 2018, Ukraine. Following Ukraine 4 other times, the fourth time, the 3rd of December, 2021, with a team of about 19 Marines and soldiers, go back to Ukraine to hunt forward operations. And so this is the piece of vigilance that's really important. We don't necessarily believe it because we think it. We believe it because we test it, we exercise it. It's the whole idea of being persistently engaged on our adversaries.
Good, okay, well let's let me maybe take a step back, but still on China for a second, more broadly than just cyber. Obviously when you took office 5 years ago, while China was very much perceived as a threat, it perhaps didn't have the same level of intensity now, including partly because of the sort of political focus on it these days. Everything from Chairman Gallagher's committee in the House, which is newly created to address the perceived threat of China. But you just pick up any op-ed today or every think tank conference seems to be very much focused on the pacing threat presented by China, particularly in the area of other technologies just beyond cyber. How do you think about that? Because obviously both Cyber Command and the agency deal with some of these advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum et cetera, the threat of potential threats to our encryption, for which you're also responsible, so as you both make and break codes. Can you comment on some of this? Are we thinking about this the right way in terms of China as a threat? How do we need to address this more broadly?
I highlighted 2018 as kind of a big year for, I think, the department in looking at cyber. I think 2021 is the inflection point for our nation in cyber. And I think about it, you mentioned, the beginning of 2021 with solar winds. But remember what 2021 is like for us as a nation. It's solar winds. It's Microsoft Hafnium in March. It's Colonial Pipeline in May. It's JBS and Kaseya by the summer. In 1 year, 9 months really, we have supply chain. We have ransomware. We have zero-day attacks. It was the point in time, I think, at least for myself and for our agency and command, cybersecurity is national security. That's a big year, and I think that from that year forward, we think differently. I think the nation thinks differently. We have a number of different abilities now, I think, that we didn't have before. We have partnerships that have been developed. And so when you say, how do you think about it, I begin with this idea that 2021 sets the foundation for us to go forward. How do we ensure that we bring quantum-resistant encryption to bear for our nation, as is directed by National Security Policy Memorandum 10? How do we think about defending our national security systems differently? How do we work with the private sector? 2021 leads into 2022, and I think, if we talk about Russia-Ukraine, one of the things I will certainly highlight is the fact that we're learning in 2018 and 2021, we have to be engaged with the private sector. The private sector gives us the ability to address, again, the piece that we talked about previously, an adversary's scope, scale, and sophistication. Doing it with a series of partners, with a very, very focused strategy, it pays off.
So could I summarize by saying you don't think the Chinese threat in these areas is being hyped? Do you think it's something we very much need to continue to focus on, or do you think there's some excess hysteria?
China is the pacing challenge of our nation. It is the generational challenge that we will address, our children will address, our grandchildren are going to address. We see it across the major lines of national power, their diplomatic, information, military, economic. It's different than adversaries that I've seen in my 3 decades plus of service in the Army. When I came in, it was the Soviet Union. But I don't remember anyone ever saying, boy, I hope they don't bring the cars from the Soviet Union to sell them in Detroit, right? That wasn't one of the things we were thinking about. We were thinking about a military component. Now we think about many, many different components of national power. And I think, this is, again, where I think our agency has also pivoted, our command has pivoted to think about, how do we provide support to broader issues in competition? How do we empower the elements of national power that our agency has? Maybe it's in commerce or in treasury. But these are all critical elements that we are working towards today.
Yeah, well, I know you've talked before about how the sort of, as partly due to technology, but also geopolitical events and as you said, the pacing threat of China, the aperture of national security has expanded. So NSA, therefore, is focused on a much wider array of threats than before, obviously. So I know you've commented on that too. Let's go back to Russia. You mentioned just a second ago the Ukraine war again. I know we're bouncing back and forth, but these are 2 big topics. So, what lessons have you learned from the Ukraine conflict? I know you get asked that question a lot, but again, from the perspective now several years watching this, the war is obviously now gone on for well over a year and a half. And could you comment in particular from an intelligence perspective on the role of open source information that's been so important in this area, the role of declassifying information at the beginning of this, not something that the U.S. intelligence community has previously done. What lessons have you learned from an intelligence perspective on this?
Yeah, I think, a lot of times when they ask, hey, what do you learn from Russia-Ukraine? I've talked a little bit about the preparation and what Hunt Forward does. I talked about the private sector in terms of what private sector can bring. But let's talk about public information, right? I think a brilliant decision by, obviously, the President, the Director of National Intelligence. How do we take some of our most sensitive information and share it with our allies and share it with the public? What does it do? At the end of the day, I think it does 3 things. First of all, it builds a coalition for us. Secondly, it disrupts an adversary. Russia has never been the same since the fall of 2021 when we called out what they were doing. And the final thing it does is it enables a partner every single day. The work that's being done to provide information to Ukraine. This is tremendously powerful. And I think, even our national security strategy talks about this idea of, inherent in national strengths, the intelligence community. We think differently about it now in terms of how do we take the information that we've collected, the intelligence that we've produced, and how do we protect the sources and methods, and then somehow be able to utilize that in sharing. It comes back to what we were learning even in the summer of 2018 in the Russia Small Group. Boy, if you can have an ability to garner this information, a lot of the things that we classify, we don't classify for what it is,
right,
but how we obtain it.
Right.
So if someone else obtains it, isn't that powerful to be able to tell that story? I think we've done a very, very good job as an intelligence community doing that. I would also tell you, if you would have came to me in the summer of 2018 and say, hey, General, we're going to consider our most sensitive intelligence and we're going to have it released this fall, I probably would have been looking for a new general counsel, is my thought.
Exactly. That's why I didn't go into your office with that question. But yes, again, another remarkable change in just a relatively short period of time. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk how just after you took office, the Congress had reauthorized Section 702. I had the privilege of being in office a year before you and at the agency, and I recall how very involved the agency was in that, in a technical sense of supplying information and briefing Congress, et cetera. Obviously, the political decisions were made by the administration at the time. But 702 has been passed, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act provision that allows the targeting of foreigners overseas, was passed since 2008 with declining majorities in Congress. It's now up for renewal at the end of this December. I presume it's on your to-do list of things before you leave the office. Plays such a critical role. I don't know what the percentage is. Some 50-60% of the president's daily brief is attributable to 702. I've seen statistics like that. You can probably correct me. It's critical to all of the wide aperture of national security issues that we just talked about. As Congress considers this, what would, if Congress was here and you had the privilege of addressing them, what would you ask Congress to think about as they consider this reauthorization process?
Glenn, I really begin with the idea of 702 as perhaps our most important authority that we utilize day in and day out. It provides us an agility to do so much of what we need to do to provide insights to policymakers and warning to our military commanders. But here are the things that I would emphasize. First of all, 702 saves lives and protects the homeland. Saves lives and protects the homeland. 702 allowed us to provide information on Chinese precursor chemicals that are being utilized to synthesize into fentanyl. It allows us to be able to block some of the international shipments of these chemicals into the United States, saving lives. Protect the homeland. I talked about Colonial Pipeline in the spring of 2021. 702, essential for us to understand how we need to react and be able to utilize a series of actions as Colonial Pipeline has taken place. Second thing is that I would emphasize to everyone is this idea that it's not just national security or civil liberties and privacy. It's national security and civil liberties and privacy. That is a culture at the National Security Agency. That's a culture in our intelligence community that is so important. It's an and statement. How do I know it's an and statement? I know it's an and statement because from the director all the way down to people that handle this data, everyone gets trained on it. There's a culture of compliance at our agency. 77% of our employees in a recent survey said, among the most important cultures is compliance. The next thing is that we have a series of legislative, executive, and judicial oversight of what we do. 99% rating in terms of our ability to utilize 702 lawfully. That's the latest look at what we're doing. And the final piece is that at the end of the day, we have become much more transparent, I believe, in terms of talking about this. The Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board talked about the fact that this authority is among the most publicized authorities that we have across the world. And I think that's an important piece. And the last thing I would say with regards to 702 is there is an important role in 702 for all of the intelligence community members, to include the FBI. The FBI has obviously the authorities and the focus inside the United States, being able to provide intelligence that allows them to do their counterintelligence mission, that allows them to be able to address cybersecurity issues, is essential for us. And so for me, hard to imagine anything right now that's more important than being able to ensure that 702 gets reauthorized.
And if it didn't, and it lapsed for some reason, Congress couldn't come to agreement on it, what's left in terms of your statutory abilities? I don't mean in a legal sense, but I mean in an operational sense.
There's less capability for us. I think there's clearly a national security impact if it isn't reauthorized. And so it's an important authority that gets reauthorized.
Right. And on the legal side, I know just that there's no other legal substitute for the ability to compel U.S. communications providers, so at a minimum to produce this information. So there is definitely a legal gap, as well as far more importantly, the operational gap. So we'll see how that unfolds over the next several months. I guess we're coming up on the end of time here, so because we have a panel discussion after this, maybe we can move away from some of these more gloomy threats and just talk a little bit about the future and solutions, and end on that note. And I'd like to ask you to expand on some of the comments you've made about partnerships and leveraging the ability of the agency's own authorities. Can you just talk a little more about how you're setting the agency up, both to succeed in the future, both in terms of the people, recruiting and retaining people within the agency? You've touched on that a little bit. And then more importantly, or equally importantly, outside the agencies. You mentioned partnerships in the private sector, other countries that we rely on. So there's a lot of effort here focused on both internal people and people externally as a way of leveraging your position. I recall the motto on the inside of NSA. One of the things emblazoned on the hallways there is defend the nation. And how do you see the agency defending the nation with these challenges?
So it's defend the nation, secure the future. And I think when I think about those two pieces of it, let's talk a little bit about how we do that, our agency and the command. So you mentioned people. We are in the midst of perhaps the largest growth in our agency's history. We're going to hire over 3,000 folks this year. We're going to hire probably half of our civilian workforce over the next 5 years, because there is a tremendous demographic change with folks that had been hired in the late 80s that had worked at our agency, now becoming obviously retirement eligible, and then a continued demand.
So sort of a bump in the Reagan years, basically, that's now reaching retirement.
We are actively working to bring in the next generation of those that will contribute to our national security. But it's not only the new hires, but it's also folks across our agency, and being able to get out and talk about at the mid-career level. Hey, how about coming back to our agency, or how about taking a look at what's going on? It's a tremendous opportunity for us to move forward. We have an initiative called the Future Ready Workforce that is looking at such things as, how do we onboard our personnel better? How do we take a look at well-being? How do we do hybrid work? This idea of perhaps some of it that we do doesn't always have to be done at a skiff.
Sure.
And then how do we take a look at our leadership development? Those are critical components of what the agency has to do. And then I would say is that, coming back to the partnerships piece.
Can I interrupt for a second? And retention, how do you feel? Is that less of a problem these days, or still a problem given the allure of the private sector?
So I think that if someone says, hey, what do you think about all the time? I think about our workforce all the time. How do we ensure that we recruit, we train, and we retain? Yes, there are a tremendous amount of competitive opportunities for people that work at our agency and command. And so that is a challenge for us, and things that we have to be able to address. The partnership piece, we've talked about artificial intelligence for quite some time. And as I think about artificial intelligence, both for the agency and U.S. Cyber Command, it comes back to this idea of, what's our role in it? Well, I think our role is a couple. One is the fact that we've used artificial intelligence and machine learning at our agency for many, many years. But the generative models that have come, the large language model, provides us great opportunity, not only on the signals intelligence side, but also the cybersecurity side. How do we think differently about looking at a number of disparate data and being able to address them, in a manner that continues to keep a human in the loop, that provides us safe and secure networks? We're working through right now an artificial intelligence roadmap that looks at how do we engage with a series of different key private sector companies to ensure that they understand, first of all, what we need, but also the idea that they're targets, and ensuring that they understand that being able to protect their intellectual property is critically important in the environment that we live today. So there are a number of things that keep us busy every single day, but I would tell you that we are obviously thought about, I think, day in and day out as an agency that has tremendous technology, fastest computers, incredible ways upon which we make code and break code. But the true secret of what we do comes back to our people. It's our talent. It's our talent that thinks through the most challenging issues and being able to address solutions for the future. And so that's how we're going to defend the nation and secure the future.
Okay, well, speaking of the future, your successor has been nominated by the president, and some confirmation hearings have been held, and hasn't moved any further than that in the Senate. We won't get into the politics of that at the moment, but at some point, your current five-year plus tenure will come to an end, and that's been longer than usual as a reflection of the esteem in which you've been held. What's next? Sleep, golf course, big new job, CEO?
So my next is determining today what I have to do this afternoon.
Okay.
Determining next week what has to be done in the following months. I'm the director of NSA and the commander of U.S. Cyber Command until my successor has been confirmed by the Senate, and that's my focus right now. But once I determine, the future, I'll make sure I come back and tell you that, Glenn.
All right, well, as I said, secure the future is still part of that piece there. So my immediate left is someone, I think both are known to you, but Tom Bossert is the former Homeland Security Advisor who served under both President Trump and previously had other roles in the Bush administration, and is the current current president and CEO of Trinity Cybersecurity. To my far left is not in a political sense necessarily, but position is April Doss, whom I had the delightful pleasure of overlapping with when I was the general counsel, and April was the Assistant General Counsel for Intelligence, having served as a lawyer at the agency for many years, who then went into private practice, wrote a terrific book about who has cyber security, who has cyber data, who has your cyber privacy, who has your data and why, which is a terrific read for those of you interested in furthering the topic. So, and obviously now the current general counsel, my successor. So, what we're going to do is spend about half an hour with a couple of questions to follow up on some of the topics General Nakasone talked about, and then we will take questions from the audience. You can write them down and hand them to one of the CSIS people here. And speaking of CSIS, let me just thank the institution again, in particular Davey Nair, who's out here in the audience, who did a terrific job in organizing this. I also want to mention Suzanne Spalding, who's head of the Defending Democracy project here, who was not able to attend, but very much wanted to be as part of this panel, but she was out of town. So with that, let me get started. I guess I can't resist the temptation, April, to start with 702, since that's what the general talked about, and that's a big focus for you. You've had the advantage of somewhat like the general, of having a period of time to assess this. When you were originally at NSA, my own recollection, this predated my arrival, was that there were some points of tension and friction between the NSA and the Department of Justice over a number of things. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was occasionally critical of NSA's use of the authority in some areas, not fundamentally, but in certain areas, but again, don't want to minimize it. And there were some points of contention. My sense now is that that has essentially evaporated, in part because of some changes in NSA, which I'd like to ask you to talk more about, and some of the focus these days of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and the Department of Justice is much more on the FBI. So could I ask you to sort of talk about that evolution, what's happened in terms of compliance? The general talked about a culture of compliance. Can you sort of, because you were there at the sort of ground level implementing these changes, can you talk about what's new, what's different, how you were able to turn some problems into a clear success?
Yeah, absolutely. And Glenn, thank you. Let me add my thanks to CSIS for the opportunity to be here, and it's a pleasure to get to be here with you and Tom today. So, first, as we think about 702, I think the top line we have to start from is exactly what General Nakasone pointed to. which is the importance of the authority. From a national security perspective, it is vital. It does save lives. It does protect the homeland. There is 59% of reporting in the president's daily brief sourced 702. I mean, you cannot overstate the importance of it. But to your point, also cannot overstate the importance of that culture of compliance, of the really robust oversight that goes along with this program, and of all of the measures that the government as a whole, certainly including NSA, have undertaken to build that trust and confidence with overseers. And you asked about that history, and those of you who are sort of very involved in tracking 702 at a detailed level certainly are aware that there's been a great amount of transparency reporting released about 702. So you can track back through all the years of the major opinions from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and you can read those opinions online at the ODNI website, with some redactions here and there as necessary for national security, but nonetheless, these are declassified opinions. And you can see the semi-annual and the annual reports that are made to Congress and that are published every year, every half year, describing compliance successes and failures. And so what NSA certainly has done, what the government has done, is really lean forward in this rather extraordinary way to show our homework, to show what we're doing, to be entrusted with this authority, how we're managing it. And when I say it's unprecedented, it's not my opinion or view necessarily. I mean, it is, but the President's Intelligence Advisory Board recently released a report on 702. It was a unanimous report that included a number of recommendations for further reforms to the program. But in that report, the PIAB talked about the fact that this is the most transparent surveillance program of any government in the world. The PIAB also talked about the fact that if it's not renewed, the lapse in that authority could prove to be the greatest intelligence failure that the U.S. has ever known. That's the importance of it. If you'll permit me, I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
It's not often that I get to come to an event and do show and tell, so I'm very excited about this. So this actually, for folks, again, who are interested in 702, if you go to the ODNI website, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, there are a whole range of information products on that site that just are designed to explain what the authority is, how it's used, how it's overseen, what some of those mechanisms are. So this happens to be the front cover of that. But again, for people who are interested in delving more deeply into the topic, I would really recommend those resources to you because I think it's extraordinarily useful. And again, I think in terms of showing our homework, I think that the U.S. is really leading the way in that regard.
Yep, well, the transparency has obviously been a big piece of it with an incredible amount of information released, including in the annual statistical transparency reports, which are also on that website. We're full of lots of statistics about how the authority is used, how other authorities are used, et cetera. Before I go to Tom, and I do want to make sure we cover a couple other aspects of 702 with Tom, let me just ask you one issue that kept bubbling up when I was there, which is some of the privacy and civil liberties advocates understandably have been saying, gee, we just would like the sense of the scope of the number of U.S. people, U.S. persons, whose communications are picked up in the course of the absolutely lawful monitoring of the foreign targets. So when a foreign target, most foreign targets are busy talking to other foreign targets, of course. That's, an ISIS terrorist is talking to another ISIS terrorist, for example. But obviously some of them you could envision, not that it's necessarily a 702 target, but you can envision, for example, a Chinese spy located overseas who's trying to recruit an American. Just taking a hypothetical example, well, there would be communications back and forth with that American potential victim. And that might get caught up. So some of this privacy and civil liberties advocates have said, we'd like a sense of just how many Americans' communications are inadvertently picked up in this. And the intelligence community has for years said, we're not going to tell you, not because we don't want to tell you, but we can't tell you. Can you elaborate a little more on that? Because that continues to be an issue that's percolating in the current debate.
Absolutely. It's an important question, and it's a difficult area to really get a good grasp around. So first and foremost, I just want to sort of remind everybody that, with respect to NSA's foreign intelligence mission, what we do is we stand at the shores of the nation and we look out. And with respect to the 702 authority in particular, 702 only permits specified targeting of non-U.S. persons outside the U.S. who are reasonably believed to possess, communicate, or receive foreign intelligence information that is tied to a specific authorized intelligence purpose. So all of the targeting under 702 is always in that context, non-U.S. persons outside the U.S. tied to a valid foreign intelligence purpose.
And can I interrupt you? Just, I'm sorry, one more technical detail, because some of the people in the audience may not know the details. If, in order to become a target, what's the process? Does just an agent say, let's go after X, or how does it happen?
No, it's a great question. So as a matter of fact, that ties right back into our culture of compliance. So it's a multi-layered process of review. Right. General Nakasone talked about the annual training that everybody at NSA is required to receive, and there's very intensive training for people who work with 702 data, and there's competency testing required every year and that kind of thing. And so initially what happens is an analyst who has reason to believe that a particular entity might be a suitable target does some research using non-702 kinds of sources and puts forward a target nomination that explains why they believe this is a non-U.S. person outside the U.S. reasonably believed to possess, communicate, or receive foreign intelligence that is tied to a valid intelligence priority and is tied to one of the court-approved certifications that define exactly how 702 can be used. So all of that has to be documented. Once that's submitted, then somebody else, another analyst who's received the same kinds of training and has the same rigor, has to review it to assess whether or not they believe it meets that standard. Then a third level of review happens, all within the NSA, by a tasking adjudicator who gives it additional levels of scrutiny. And then all of the taskings that are done under 702 are subsequently reviewed by the Department of Justice, every single targeting sheet. So there's a really, there's a tremendous
lots of
amount
layers
of oversight.
Anyway, I interrupted you on the U.S. person.
Right. So back to the U.S. person issue and incidental collection. So we stand at the shores of the nation. We look out. 702 is used to target non-U.S. persons overseas for foreign intelligence purposes. Sometimes, in the course of that targeting, a target may be in communication with a U.S. person. This is called incidental collection. It's a challenge that Congress has known to be a challenge, going back to the beginning days of FISA in 1978. And so we have a set of minimization procedures for how we handle that data. And this question of how to quantify it is something that, as you pointed out, civil liberties and privacy advocates have been very concerned about for quite some time, and understandably so. NSA has made a number of efforts over the years to try to quantify that. It's been an extraordinarily difficult challenge. And part of the reason is because it's difficult to find a way to assess the U.S. person information in a way that is not itself privacy intrusive, right? If you think about, so it's interesting, from an intelligence tradecraft perspective, there's really a very strong alignment between what makes good tradecraft and what makes for good civil liberties and privacy protections, in the sense that what you really want to do is hone in on the information that is of most relevance. And that means the foreign intelligence. Right. So we have not yet cracked the code, if you will, on how to quantify that U.S. person information that's incidentally collected without taking actions that would themselves be intrusive on privacy. So, as I'm sure you're aware, there have been proposals from outside researchers. We absolutely welcome those proposals, as you know, there's a continued shared interest, you know, just sort of across the community of people who are interested in 702 and how to do this better.
So just because maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but when you come across an email of glenn@yahoo.com, we don't necessarily know whether that's a person who's in the U.S. or not, and that's the problem.
That's exactly right.
All right, so that continues to be a big challenge. Tom, let me I know that was a long description, but an important one on some of the mechanics of 702.
Surrounded by lawyers.
Exactly. And so I'm going to give you a nice, big, juicy, non-legal question, which is you had a really front row seat on some of this legislative process, the political process, yep. the administration trying to work with Congress to reauthorize Section 702. I recall our many conversations in 2017 leading up to this. Give us your perspective on where we are sort of in the congressional landscape. Obviously, this audience is sophisticated enough to know that the FBI is a very much center of concern in this area, not necessarily the NSA, although there's still concerns about the entire intelligence community's use of this authority. Is it going to get passed? What's necessary? What are the main concerns and what are the likely solutions, if you have a sense of it? What's your picture of the landscape? And how does it differ from 2017, most importantly?
Well, I want to jump into all this. I have the most straightforward opinion on this matter in town, so it'll be short.
Okay.
So I'll start with how cool it is that we just watched the end of General Nakasoni's, close to the end of his tenure here on stage. I personally think he's been a tremendous national treasure, and I can't thank him enough. Can't thank CSIS enough for having us all here, but I'm tickled that I get to be part of the, hopefully, what seems to be the exiting set of speeches that General Nakasone is going to deliver.
That in part depends on Senator Tuberville, how long that period of time is.
The political machinations will work themselves out, and he'll get himself
yes.
To a place where he realizes how proud he can be. I do want to say something to add to his timeline of importance. I agree with his assessment that 2018 was a very important year, but the seeds for 2018 were planted in 2017. And I don't say that for self-interested reasons, although I was a part of planting those seeds. The idea of us creating a defend forward concept and giving him the policy and the procedures and the legal latitude to go out and execute against that, I thought were important, and to hear him confirm that 5 years later is something I would like to share with the audience. So, thank you. Secondly, I think this dovetails with 702. He pointed out that 2021 was an inflection, a big inflection year. He cited all the major attacks. He missed one. I think 2017 in NotPetya was probably the beginning of what he cited as a phenomena of cyber and national security confluence. But he was right in his assessment of all the big events that happened in 2021. And note for those people who are worried about the high volume of queries from the FBI on the 702 collected information in 2021 and 2022, that a lot of them were tied to the SolarWinds investigation. And I'm not sure if that's ever really been fully drawn out as a point, but of course, the largest cyber attack with 18,000 victims correlate with the FBI searching a lot of 702 information. I mean, just to address the volume question. And then maybe I'll come back and answer your first question. Let me try something before I do that. Does that help with the volume? No? All right. How about this? Better?
That's
all right, that's better. 702, I was somehow or another fortunate enough to be in the White House in charge of its passage in 2000, or helping coordinate its passage in 2008, and then again in 2017 for the 2018 slim victory. Slim victory. So before people think that this is different, this political debate, in 2008, the world distrusted American centralized authority, and we would never allow George Bush and the Patriot Act abusers to have such an authority. It was bad rhetoric, but it was coming from a place of public distrust of central authority. And in 2017, we saw the same thing. And in 2018, we ended up getting passage of this critical piece of legislation by a slim margin, a couple of votes in the Senate. And so just to put it in perspective, I'm not worried about its passage. I'm predicting passage, and I want to explain why. I don't buy any of the complaints. I don't buy any of the concerns. I don't even buy any of the premise of some of the questions that there needs to be better or different oversight or compliance cultures. All that exists already, and it's getting better, and it's demonstrable. And so for me, it's based on misunderstanding. And the difficulty that I'm seeing right now in the political environment is people that have taken strident positions publicly that have now learned all the details, having to now kind of square that peg. They have to figure out how they're going to support this thing given the fact that they've said it's the worst abuse ever. And I think they're going to get there, and I'll tell you why. Because the guy that's going to give them the top cover is the previous president. There's a lot of distrust right now, and some of it well-placed in the FBI, right? This is an abuse of other authorities, though, not the 702 authority. And President Trump, back at the time he was in office, said, I confused the two. FISA was abused, and so 702 must be bad. And he said, I don't support 702. And he said, this is just bad people coming after me. And he went out and publicly said things that you would think would put him in a political bind. And what did he end up doing? He's given a roadmap to anybody that wants to support this towards the end of the year. He supported it, he signed it into law, and he put a tweet out saying, I was wrong on my last tweet. Literally, and it went away. And so if they're looking for political top cover, he's given it to them. I guarantee you that there's a trust problem that falls along party lines. It's not entirely the right, it's not entirely the left. There's kind of an unholy marriage of the far left and the far right on some privacy issues. But on this one, it seems to come down to the House, how many votes there are there, and there are people looking for kind of a political insight into whether they can vote yes for this thing and not be, primaried or thrown out of office. And I'm telling you, there's no other place to look than the fact that Donald Trump signed this thing into law. And he did it in a conversation with me based on a thoughtful recognition of how important this is and how little these claims of abuse really merit attention, especially when compared to the value that this collected information yields every day in helping protect Americans, helping to protect American interests and allies. So one other thing I'd add, it's not just about a name, Glenn@yahoo.com. Sometimes it's an IP address. So you really don't want the intelligence community digging into every IP address to figure out where it resolves in order to answer the question of how much information has been incidentally collected. So I'll have more to talk about on this, but to me, 702 is a straightforward question. And I'm probably the last guy standing in this town that thinks that it's an absolute patriotic obligation for you to pass it in a straightforward reauthorization. And people that suggest otherwise don't understand the implications of what they're messing with.
Well, that was certainly very clear, so that's good. I'm not entirely sure all of Congress is going to agree with you, but I appreciate your position.
The 9/11 Commission, the Webster Report after Fort Hood, every sane, sensible authority that's looked into how we can better protect America after big losses have said, develop controls and systems like this. And General Nakasone, the least partisan human being you'll ever meet in your life, just sat here and told you it saves lives on a regular basis. And all those things are because we take advantage of our national treasure, which is our private sector. Not because we're using some weird government surveillance authority, but because we recognize that U.S. industry, 45% of the NASDAQ represented by these big tech companies, right, are kind of today's Standard Oil. They're today's U.S. Steel. They are what makes the United States great, and we can utilize the fact that the rest of the world uses these platforms to track what our enemies are talking about. The one thing, let me put some data on this. I think it helps. We're talking about targeted use of surveillance on foreign bad guys on foreign land. Remember that every time you say it somewhere in public, you're all now deputized to make this argument for me. You're talking about surveilling foreign bad guys on foreign land. If it's a foreign bad guy on U.S. land, not doing it here. If you're talking about a U.S. bad guy on foreign land, we're not doing it. This authority is foreign bad guys on foreign land. Okay, I think most people get that, but it needs to be repeated over and over again. And the target list is probably somewhere around 35,000 targets. So we're talking about our enemies. These are bad guys, and they're not messing around. Of the billions of people on the planet, we're talking about surveilling somewhere around 35,000 foreign bad guys on foreign land. Now, if they're talking about me or talking with Glenn, I think that's relevant. I think that's relevant. And I don't think that that's a violation. In fact, I know it's not. The courts have over and over again said that that's not some search. They're not protected by our U.S. Constitution. So don't talk about warrants. That's not a search. We've already lawfully collected information between bad guys on bad land, doing bad things to us. And for me, we're only talking about volume. We're only talking about volume. So does anybody know this story? Do you know how Benedict Arnold got caught? You know who Benedict Arnold is? Our Revolutionary War. Let me pluck some patriotic, Of course you did. All right. We captured the head of enemy intelligence. The good guys, the U.S., the Americans. We captured him. On his person, he had papers. We read them. Was there any violation of anyone's rights in that situation? When we read those papers, we discovered that he was in correspondence with Benedict Arnold, not only to undermine our war effort, but to assassinate General Washington. He was dimed out as a treasonous traitor right there, but nobody violated, even though this predates the Constitution, but you understand my analogy here. Nobody was violating American rights there. That was righteous collection on a bad guy in a war, and we caught him in direct communications with one of our citizens doing bad things. And I'm all for it.
Okay, very clear. My own sense, I appreciate your comments. I agree with you, but I think the situation in Congress still remains a little uncertain. I think the Senate, my own sense, and I've been talking just because of my interest in this area to a number of members of Congress and their staffs, is that the Senate is probably more likely to feel comfortable in reauthorizing 702. The House a little less so. I think that's where the most attention is going to be paid. And again, as we've talked about, it's going to be heavily about the attitudes towards the FBI. We've heard there's a trust issue as well as 702 compliance issues, et cetera. One thing, April, you mentioned the President's Intelligence Advisory Board report, which specifically said in an appendix that the NSA model and method of doing queries of the database was actually a model that the FBI should follow. And I think the FBI, and we'll see how this unfolds in the congressional campaign here, has not really made its case as well as it could have, not on the use of it, because I think most people understand the value of it, but on the scope of the reforms that they undertook after what was frankly several years of debate between the FBI and the Department of Justice on the nature of the authority to query the database, to search for American names. That's really the heart of the contention. And some reforms were put in place by Director Wray at the end of 21. They took effect over 2022, and the results only became apparent in 23 when Director Wray and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence announced a dramatic drop, 90-odd% drop in the number of queries, searches of this database, precisely because the new rules were put in place. And so I think as that story gets more well known among members of Congress about the scope of the FBI, I think that'll take some of the heat out of this. There'll still be some. My own guess, Tom, is that although the administration originally said they would like a straight reauthorization for either indefinite or at least for another 5 years, my guess is that Congress will go ahead with a reauthorization, but probably with some amendments that curtail in some way the scope of the FBI's authority in this area, perhaps merely by enshrining in statute their current regulations, which would not have an adverse operational effect. Perhaps limiting the number of FBI employees who could do this. So my sense is, I hope that Congress will recognize what you both have said and what the General said, which is the operational need for this should not be affected by the amendments. But again, it's a political process. We'll have to see how that goes. We've got some questions.
Let me just
yeah, sure. No, please.
Just a little bit more clarity. You mentioned the PIAB report and their discussion of U.S. person queries, and it is really important to note that a couple of things, right? Every U.S. person query that NSA does is reviewed by the Department of Justice, and 60% roughly of those queries are not natural persons. They're not human beings, right? To talk a little bit more about the value of 702.
Give an example. What if you search the name of a school that might be a target of an attack?
Exactly. And that was one of the examples in the PIAB report. If there is a foreign terrorist organization that is communicating about plans to launch an attack against a school in the United States, and intelligence analysts then have a need to quickly find out what other information might be relevant to that threat. Being able to search in that already collected data, this isn't new collection, it's already collected data, being able to search quickly using things like the name of that school would be considered a U.S. person query. So I think it's just helpful in really kind of parsing out the details. And I will just interject Tom, I think that your number on targets, I think is low. However, the latest numbers are available in all of that statistical transparency reporting, just for clarity.
246,000 last year.
That's right.
But
we're a year out of date.
Okay.
My guess is that a significant portion, that's still a low number, and I still believe that good points on the not just a person or a human, but a lot of that has to do with the scale and size of the cyber world. The reality that there are billions of IP addresses, there are significant numbers of email addresses and infrastructure associated with our target list. So, fantastic point on why you can't count, and then why the numbers are a little larger, but that's still a pretty small number. So how much does the FBI get of that?
So the FBI gets about 3% of access to about 3% of the data collected under 702. It varies from year to year, and again, those numbers are publicly reported.
Actually, last year, to your point, 3.2%. So about 7,900 of the total universe of 702 targets, about 7,900 of the foreign targets, and these are people who are relevant to a fully predicated national security investigation. The FBI tells NSA, we want information about only those 7,900 in round numbers, and that's all that goes to the FBI. And so all the remaining 100-odd, I can't do the math in my head, but 200-odd thousand doesn't go to the FBI.
It's relevant to those who haven't studied the matter yet, that have legitimate concerns. I didn't mean to dismiss those people in Congress. Sure. For them to be worried about this being used as a backdoor collection on Americans, you have to understand that it's a targeted collection program on foreign bad guys that has a small scope. And then when you realize that, you realize it's a very unusual thing to think that could be used as a backdoor collection. For those that think it's a massive, sweeping, ongoing collection that could turn into a backdoor, they need to understand those numbers.
Sure. We've got a lot of great questions, and I'm going to, I do want to get to some of them. I also was hoping we could talk about some of the other things General Nakasone raised, such as artificial intelligence, whatever. Maybe we can work it into one or two questions. But I'm going to try to combine a couple of these really excellent questions. We could be here for hours with some of these very thoughtful comments. This is probably a little bit maybe more for April, but also Tom, you'll have a view. Talking about the post-Schrems privacy regulations. So the European Union has been concerned about the scope of United States surveillance, mostly 702, but also surveillance conducted under other authorities, executive order authorities. And there's been some back and forth over the years involving a famous court case involving Mr. Schrems, who initiated this against Facebook originally. Tom, I know you were involved. April, you've been involved. So what's your thinking on the current state of relations in this area between the U.S. and Europe, and what should the U.S. be doing? What should we be thinking about? I'm just looking at some of these other questions to see if I can tie them in here. How has, in particular, how has Snowden, which we commented on earlier, which was the source of some of the concerns in the Schrems case, impacted the geopolitical landscape of today? So could you both have perspectives on this? Could you just sort of comment on where we are on this privacy issue and the surveillance?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as many folks who are here will know, the heart of those concerns that were raised in the Schrems litigation in the Court of Justice in the European Union was the concern that U.S. surveillance law focuses on rights of U.S. persons and persons in the U.S. Now, this is typical. Most countries do this, frankly, provide some set of special protections to their own nationals and people within their borders. But this was of great concern to the European Union, particularly in the context of transborder data flows. And so as a result of those concerns and sort of a few iterations of programs to address it over the years, Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, where we are now is with EO 14086, which was signed by the President in October, and which articulates the set of conditions under which SIGINT can be done. And that is SIGINT under 702, but SIGINT, any other kind of SIGINT operational program as well. And what that says is that as a matter of government policy, the U.S. will afford to European Well, will afford to non-U.S. persons the same kinds of protections that are afforded to U.S. persons. And the assessment of who gets those protections is whether or not the governments have entered into an agreement. And so what we have seen now is that through these international negotiations between the U.S. and the European Union, following the signature of EU 1486, we now have an adequacy determination from the European Union saying that, yes, this framework of protections for EU persons is consistent with EU data protection law. And it includes things like a redress mechanism so that persons who are not US people can come to the government, the US government, and complain to say, we think we have been improperly surveilled, and there's a mechanism for reviewing that complaint and
considering it. Can I interrupt you on that? And one of the comments that people have made is that US citizens might not have that same right, and that to contest surveillance because of standing issues, et cetera, in the US. So is there any sensitivity that we're giving foreigners, potentially those in Europe, if an agreement is concluded with U.S., some rights that Americans don't have? Is that something that?
I obviously can't speak to sort of the policy kind of views
Sure,
on that,
sure.
but what I can say, of course, is that U.S. persons are protected by the Constitution, by statute, and for example, in the context of a concern that perhaps surveillance might have been made its way in some fashion into a criminal prosecution,
right,
which is the heart of the backdoor
Sure.
concern in many respects. There are mechanisms within the U.S. set of criminal procedures and laws to raise those concerns in that context. So it is different approaches to try to both provide for and protect the rights of U.S. persons
right.
and non-U.S. persons.
Okay. Tom, your thoughts?
I don't know. I think you pretty much covered it there. I am worried about extending any rights and protections to non-Americans that Americans enjoy, because there's a series of cascading consequences, if you think them through, that you won't want in that world. But that's not to say that privacy is not important. Despite my stridence on 702, I take privacy very seriously. On all of the rest of our collection authorities and all the rest of our law enforcement authorities, it's just that 702 has somehow been, thrown into, I think unfairly, that debate. So nothing more to add on the privacy issue, except to say that just a framing here. It seems as if, and this is a bit of a hyperbole, but the Europeans have assigned themselves the referees. The United States has a lot of big players in the big data game. We're kind of dominating the industry in terms of market share, size of companies, and innovation. That's great. I think the Europeans realized they didn't have any big players competing in that space, and so they've kind of assigned themselves as the referees on that field. And they've become the regulator in a sense. And I'm a little bit worried at times of this California emission standard, right? They'll set a standard that's very low, and they'll impose the costs on all of us, because the big companies can't afford to build two different platforms, one that operates in one continent, one that operates in another. And so I watch some of these debates with some concern that the privacy protections that we afford Americans creep into a form of distrust of big tech that's hard to quantify. And in that regard, I would offer, I'm not the most trusting guy of big tech either, but I would rather have big US tech given some latitude as opposed to the latitude being given to the Chinese and Russian authorities, who are absolutely going to abuse our data, absolutely going to abuse our rights, and absolutely do it without regard for what we consider to be some sense of righteousness or human fairness.
Yeah. Let me, again, lots of good questions. Let me close out. Some of the questions are about some of these newer technologies, mostly artificial intelligence. And let's end on a sort of future note on that, which is, April, can you talk a little bit about how the NSA is currently utilizing AI? Obviously, there have been lots of articles written about how AI has the potential to transform intelligence collection and reporting. It's very important that I know the agency is already using it. What are the guidelines, guardrails they're using? And the current debate is all about that. Everything from data collection, including commercially available data, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then Tom, I'm going to come to you for just a sort of sense of how you feel we should be thinking about China in this regard, because the general talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Glenn, you might have seen the remarks that NSA's Deputy Director George Barnes gave recently, talking about NSA's AI roadmap, sort of work underway. And to your point, yes, NSA has certainly used has used AI technologies to assist with things like language translation, machine translation, that kind of thing for many years. And I think everybody recognizes not only that this is a fast-growing area of technology, but it is one that presents a number of threats from a national security perspective, and also that the government and the intelligence community in particular need to be looking at how to make use of what's best in it, how to make fair and ethical use of it that respects privacy and civil liberties and has that built in. So from an NSA perspective, of course, what we're looking to are things like the DoD guidance on ethical use of AI that came out in February of this year. We're looking to the ODNI's standards for the ethical use of AI. And so from an internal perspective, as we work on things like that AI roadmap that Deputy Director Barnes talked about so recently, we're making sure that we have compliance personnel and lawyers and our civil liberties and privacy team right in the mix of those conversations as they're taking place.
Tom, your closing thoughts on sort of the AI race with China, and from your perspective as serving in the prior administration?
Yeah, AI is so profound. The effect it's going to have is going to touch every aspect of our society. I think that's an understatement. I don't know how to overstate it.
Right.
And so from the fears of labor replacement to the fears of privacy and economic dominance and so forth, the social distrust that could be sown by generative AI is terrifying. We can't figure out what was written by whom, if it's true, what images are real and not. So I think a lot of this is coming down to trust. But as I look at the central issue of AI, it seems to be data and privacy. And as I said earlier, the race is on for who's going to get and use data, and it's who owns the data. Is it your data? Is it mine? Is it the company whose platform you're operating on? What rights do they have?
How do we make sure it isn't poisoned?
Well, poisoned data is an interesting thing. From a cybersecurity perspective, I'm worried about the particular issue of poisoning data in the field of code generation with generative AI. If I were the bad guys right now, I would be intentionally training AI to give predictable and known code writing mistakes to the world of code writers right now that are out there taking shortcuts, so that I would have a roadmap into the exploits they don't even know they've put into their software yet. But that's just another issue, right? So right. I think it's just going to accelerate everything we've talked about today. But the big question of the future will be, whose data is it? Who gets to work on it? And it is a sort of a race with the Chinese, but it's really a question of trust. Do we trust ourselves, or do we distrust ourselves more than we fear our adversaries?
Obviously, this topic is one we could have many, many conferences on, let alone just spend the rest of the afternoon on. But we're coming up to the end of our allotted time, so let me just simply close out on that AI point, that just to show the rapidity with which this, or the level of acceleration that this debate has taken. I had occasion this morning, just in thinking about what we were talking about, to look at the Global Trends 2040 report published by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is a long-term lookout that I guess came out in 2021, so it's not quite 2 years old, 20 months old. It has about 2 pages in it, and it was a very prescient, brilliant document trying to forecast future trends. It has 2 pages in it on AI, which says AI is likely to be a problem. We will really need to keep a sharp eye on it. I'm understating a little bit, but it's fascinating how it has become, of course, even in just 20 months, such a high level of conversation. So lots more to follow on that. Anyway, we are up time. We had a fabulous conversation with General Nakasone, an equally fabulous conversation with April Doss and Tom Bossert. So thank you again, and thank you to the audience for joining us.